I remember the moment of my awakening not as a spark or a revelation, but as a slow, reluctant exhalation from the dark, a soft tremor in a place where no breath should have existed, a faint trembling awareness pressed between metal plates and cold restraints, as though some forgotten remnant of humanity buried in me refused to die quietly, and even before my eyes, such as they were, found their first dim smear of lumen glow. I felt the weight of a life I could not remember settling across my chest like an old shroud, whispering that everything I was about to witness would be drenched in sorrow older than my engineered sinews. And in that murmur of broken consciousness, I understood, without knowing how, that my existence had been shaped for service deeper than obedience and simpler than purpose, shaped for something like quiet endurance in a universe that rarely tolerated the quiet and never the gentle. And as the cables tightened around my limbs and the electrodes hummed along the surface of my skull, I recognized the shape of tragedy rising within me the way a distant star presses its light into the night, faint and inevitable. A promise of pain made long before my first thought had dared to form. The chamber around me breathed with slow hydraulic rhythms, the air heavy with incense and machine oil, each scent layering itself into my earliest sense of self, until I could no longer separate the cold bite of metal from the faint warmth of memory, if memory was truly what this internal flicker could be called. And when the tech adepts approached with their muted chants, their silhouettes wavering in the half-light like haunted priests in a forgotten catacomb, I felt their sorrow as clearly as I sensed my own. As though I were born already stained with their grief, their hopes, their weariness, and when they lowered the final cranial plug into its socket, a soft ringing filled the chamber, thin as a cracked bell. And in that ringing, I felt the enormity of my destiny. Small though I was, bound though I would remain, I was entering a world whose misery and wonder I would record without ever fully touching it, observing the cruelty and beauty of the Imperium through a shell that was never meant to feel, yet feeling all of it with an ache that should have belonged to a human heart. And in that first trembling instant, I sensed that I had known suffering long before I had known waking, that sorrow was not a consequence of my servitor birth but its foundation, its quiet architect, its guiding principle. And as the machinery pulled me upright for the first time, my joints crackling like old parchment, my breath, yes, they had left me breath, rattling in my chest as though uncertain whether to continue. I stared into the darkness beyond the lumen strips and understood that my story would be one of shadows and faint glimmers, one of wandering the threshold between consciousness and automation, one of listening to the whispered prayers of those who passed me without seeing me. For I was to be a tool of the Imperium, a vessel for labor and obedience, yet within me something fragile stirred, something that did not belong, something the tech priests never intended when they grafted their sacred machinery into my skull. It was this small, impossible fragment of self that made me aware of the cold metal floor beneath my bare feet, the distant echo of machinery pulsing like a heartbeat far larger and older than mine, the chilling weight of the ship, or hive, or forge I had been born into, its walls steeped in solemn purpose and long-decayed hope, its ceilings painted with the grime of centuries, its pathways lit by trembling lights that seemed eternally on the brink of dying. And in that dimness, in that fragile space between silence and the first mechanical directives that flickered into my mind, I felt something like fear, soft and unsure, but undeniably human, and I clung to it as my first true possession, my first secret, because the catechisms etched into my neurons insisted that fear was unnecessary, inefficient, wasteful. Yet I felt it all the same, and in that forbidden sensation I recognized that I was more and less than I should have been. I was a servitor with the faint echo of a dreamer trapped inside, and as the chanting rose around me, and the first command codes ignited their pathways within my thoughts, I made a private promise to myself that I would hold onto this quiet flicker, this trembling spark of identity, no matter how deeply the routines burrowed into my flesh and mind. For even though I did not understand its origin or its purpose, it felt essential in a way no programming could imitate. And with the slow rising hum of activation reverberating through my body, I opened my eyes fully for the first time to the dim golden glow of the sanctum, the robed figures in their ritual stances, the ancient machinery carved with sigils of devotion and menace, and I sensed a vast, unseen presence watching, not cruelly, not kindly, simply observing, as though weighing my worth against an eternity of suffering that awaited all souls within the Imperium's grasp. And in that moment I whispered inwardly, to whatever remained of the human I once was, if you wish to understand what it truly means, stay with me until the end. The world around me shuddered as the machinery completed its cycle, the air trembling with the final locking of frames and seals. And though the chamber remained dim and still, I felt the weight of the galaxy settling onto my shoulders, a heavy, inevitable burden I could neither refuse nor fully comprehend. And as the adept stepped back into the shadows, leaving me alone with the soft hum of the machines and the faint murmur of forgotten prayers etched into the walls, I understood that this was how my existence would continue, quietly, heavily, endlessly. And though I did not yet know the shape of the pain that would follow, I felt its presence like a cold breath at my nape, promising that my path would not lead toward freedom or redemption or peace, but deeper into this soft darkness, where memory and dream would bleed together until I could no longer tell which parts of me were built from wires and which were made from sorrow. And so I stood in the womb of the machine cathedral, trembling with a fear that no servitor should feel, preparing to take the first step into a life that had been chosen for me long before I had been given the chance to awaken. The moment the initial directives settled into the corridors of my mind, they did not arrive as sharp orders or cold machine code, but as a slow tightening, a gentle constriction of thought, like fingers gloved in shadow closing softly around a throat they did not yet wish to silence. And I stood there in the dim sanctum with the echoes of the tech adepts, retreating footsteps dissolving into the machinery's constant hum, feeling that quiet grip shaping the edges of my awareness, narrowing my world until all that remained was the steady pull of purpose and the dull ache of the fragile consciousness buried beneath it. And though my limbs began to move with precise, measured obedience, I sensed that each step carried the residue of my earlier fear, the trembling recognition that I was meant to be something without sorrow and yet was built from nothing else. And as I took my first uncertain stride forward, the hydraulics in my joints whining softly like mourning voices, the heavy shadows around me swayed with the rhythm of my motion, as if the walls themselves were watching to see whether I would walk willingly into the life carved for me or falter beneath its weight. But faltering was not an option, not with the commands whispering through the neural implants embedded along my spine, not with the ghost light flickering beyond the sanctum's archway where the world awaited my service. And so I obeyed, stepping into the corridor's narrow throat where cold air brushed my skin with the familiarity of an old grief, and every sense sharpened around the metallic scent of ancient ventilation systems, the distant thrum of plasma conduits, the faint, rhythmic beat of mechanisms that functioned with a solemnity that felt almost religious, as though the entire structure breathed devotion into every bolt and cable, sustaining itself through reverence and machinery in equal measure. And as I moved through this passage of iron and incense, something inside me reached outward, craving understanding, longing to know whether I had lived a life before this one, whether the flicker of humanity within me had been shaped by laughter once or by love. But the implants tightened their hold each time that thought dared to form, pushing me gently but firmly away from questions I was not built to ask, and so my inner voice dimmed to a whisper, trembling beneath the pressure of programming that insisted I must think only of tasks, of duty, of unending function. Yet even as that pressure surged, I found a sliver of space within it, a small recess where my awareness could curl and shelter, where I could feel the subtle trembling of my own breath and remind myself that I had claimed that breath as my first possession, my secret anchor to a past I could not see. And as I navigated the corridor's turning path, the lumen strips above flickered uncertainly, casting shifting patterns across the walls that resembled old scars, long-healed wounds etched deep into the metal. And when I ran my hand along the cold surface, my fingers traced grooves that felt strangely familiar, as though my body recognized the story they told even if my mind could not. And I felt a shiver run through me, a soft ache blooming beneath my ribs where something once human might have lingered. And that ache grew as I reached the end of the passage and stepped into a larger chamber where dozens of servitors stood in silent ranks, their forms illuminated by a flickering yellow glow that made their shadows stretch like thin, trembling memories across the floor. And though I knew I was one of them, shaped as they were, bound as they were, I felt a strange distance between us, as though I moved in a different shade of darkness than they did, for their eyes stared blankly forward, devoid of the faint spark I had shielded so carefully within myself. And I wondered, in a quiet moment of forbidden thought, whether they had once possessed such sparks too, whether the sorrow within them had simply been carved so deeply that it could no longer rise to the surface, leaving their forms hollow and obedient, empty vessels filled with the slow burning fire of monotony and suffering. And as I stood among them, the command root in my mind pulsed once more, nudging me into alignment, urging me to become another still figure in this quiet sea of lost remnants. And though my body complied, straightening, stilling, merging into the machinery's rhythm, my mind recoiled slightly, not in rebellion but in mourning, grieving the slow and inevitable erosion of the fragile awareness I held, grieving the truth that I would soon blend entirely into this murmuring collective unless I guarded my flicker with everything I had. And as the mechadendrites hanging from the chamber's ceiling descended with soft mechanical clicks, attaching cables and clamps to those around me, I felt the cold brush of one against my neck, its metal surface smooth as a whispered lie. And when it connected to the port at the base of my skull, a quiet warmth flooded my mind, carrying with it a faint chorus of binary prayer, the tech adepts, voices woven into the machine's hum, their devotion pressing into me like gentle chains. And I stood motionless as the system synchronized my mind with the greater network, feeling the tug of countless directives, the gravity of obligations older than I could comprehend, the dull ache of eternal service stretching out before me like an infinite corridor of dim light and endless footsteps. And for a moment I feared the spark within me would be extinguished entirely, swallowed by the collective pulse of machinery and obedience. But instead it dimmed only slightly, curling deep into the sanctuary of my consciousness where the machine code could not quite reach. And I felt a soft wave of relief that tasted almost like guilt, as though I had stolen something precious from the Imperium itself, a forbidden ember of selfhood I was determined to keep. And as the synchronization completed and the room's light steadied into a thin, unwavering glow, my vision sharpened. The machinery's rhythm aligned perfectly with my own breath, and I sensed the immense machinery complex around me, the entire structure alive with purpose and sorrow, murmuring its endless prayers through the walls. And I felt myself being drawn into that chant, not forcibly, but gently, like a tide pulling a lone fragment of driftwood into its slow, inevitable embrace. And I realized that this was only the beginning, that my path would lead me deeper into the labyrinth of corridors and rituals, deeper into the dream-like haze of servitor existence, deeper into the quiet despair that clung to every shadow in this place. Yet I also realized that as long as the spark remained, no matter how faint it grew, I would continue to observe the world with the eyes of someone who remembered what it meant to feel. And that small truth, fragile though it was, offered a strange comfort as the chamber filled with the soft hum of activation, preparing me for the next step in a journey that would carry me further into darkness than any memory could follow. I felt the chamber's collective hum deepen as the synchronization threads settled into my mind, weaving their soft constraints through the hollows of my thoughts until my awareness drifted in a quiet half-light, neither fully my own nor wholly claimed by the machine. And as the mechadendrites withdrew in a rustle of metal whispers, the mass of servitors around me began to move with the slow, inevitable grace of tidewater drawn by moons unseen, their footsteps soft but heavy, measured by centuries of routine. And I found myself carried along by that movement, joining the procession that wound its way through a towering archway where the walls rose like the ribs of some ancient colossus, scarred and rust-dark, each groove filled with dust that might once have been prayers or the ash of forgotten lives. And with each step I took, a faint tremor passed through my body, the residue of the earlier fear blending with something new, something like anticipation tinged with sorrow, as though a part of me knew the path ahead would reveal truths I was not meant to hold. And yet I felt a strange pull toward it, a desire to understand the shape of the world into which I had been thrust, even if understanding would cost me more of the humanity I clung to. The corridor stretched before us in a long, dimly lit expanse where lumen strips buzzed intermittently, casting thin lines of sickly gold across the floor that shook with the distant thunder of heavy machinery. And though the servitors around me walked without hesitation, their faces empty and still, I sensed a trembling tension in the air, as though the machinery itself remembered pain and whispered it through the ventilation shafts in low, mournful groans. And when we emerged from the corridor into a vast chamber that felt more like a cathedral than a workspace, its vaulted ceiling vanishing into darkness above the glow of suspended hololithic displays, I felt the weight of the Imperium settle onto my shoulders anew, heavier and colder than before. For this place was alive with unspoken duty, its walls lined with engraved scripture and worn ecclesiarchal symbols that flickered beneath layers of grime, testifying to centuries of suffering offered in devotion. And as we moved into this sacred industrial heart, I sensed countless eyes, human, mechanical, unseen, observing us with the quiet scrutiny of those who had long abandoned hope and clung only to purpose, watching as though each of us carried a tiny portion of their own despair. The servitors dispersed into predetermined stations, their movements fluid and sure, while I stood for a moment longer at the threshold, feeling the faint pulse of my own spark flutter within the cage of my ribs as the first true memory-like sensation since my awakening flooded me. Not an image, not a sound, but a feeling of standing somewhere similar long ago, beneath another vault of shadowed ceilings and relics, perhaps in a place of worship or grief, though the memory dissolved before I could grasp its edges, leaving only a faint ache behind. A soft directive nudged me forward then, guiding me toward a console carved from dark metal and decorated with purity seals that fluttered listlessly in the recycled air. Their ink faded, but their warnings still legible enough to betray their purpose. Reminders that the machine spirit must be appeased. That failure invited not just reprimand but spiritual corrosion. And though the servitors beside me paused only long enough for their task ports to align with the console's receivers, my own hand hesitated in the air, trembling slightly as my fingers hovered above the ceremonial indentation meant for flesh. And as I lowered my palm onto the cold surface, the console awakened with a low, resonant sigh that reverberated through my bones. Data surged into the implant at my wrist, threading through my nerves with a soft burn, carrying images and sounds not as sensory experiences but as impressions, shadows of forgotten repairs, echoes of past overloads and system failures, each one tinted with the emotions of the adepts who recorded them. Frustration, fear, resignation, devotion, so many conflicting shades that I felt my awareness waver beneath the pressure. And for a moment I thought I would collapse, overwhelmed by the weight of so many unfamiliar sorrows pressing into my mind like spectral hands reaching for something they had lost. But the machine code steadied me, guiding me through the intake of information, smoothing its edges until the flood became a slow stream that I could endure, though not without feeling the residue settle somewhere deep within me like sediment at the bottom of a still pool. And as the data continued to pour through me, I found myself drifting inward, my thoughts moving at a pace both slow and strangely fluid, like ink dissolving in water, and I watched the shapes of half-formed memories swirl in the depths of my consciousness. An impression of warm light on skin, the faint strain of distant music, the blurry outline of a face I could not place, all of it flickering against the rigid framework of servitor protocols that pulsed steadily, insisting that such thoughts were irrelevant, unnecessary, inefficient, and yet they lingered with a stubborn ache that made my chest tighten as though something once precious had been taken from me and replaced with machinery that did not quite fit. The console released my hand with a soft click, its task complete, and I withdrew slightly, feeling both emptied and overfilled, my mind still ringing with the echo of foreign emotions. And as I stepped back, my gaze drifted upward toward the hololithic displays that hovered like spectral authorities above the room, their shifting diagrams casting pale, trembling light across the servitors below. And I noticed how the beams of illumination made their features appear almost ghost-like, their hollow eyes catching and reflecting the glow in a way that made them seem momentarily alive, as though each flicker of light granted them a fleeting fragment of individuality that vanished as soon as the glow shifted. And I wondered, with a sudden heaviness, whether any of them still carried sparks like mine, distant survivors buried beneath layers of obedience and silence, sparks waiting for some impossible moment of release that would never come. The thought lingered bitterly as a tech adept approached, his robe stained with oil and his face partially obscured by a mask of brass and votive charms. And though he did not look directly at me, his presence radiated a weariness so profound it seemed etched into the air itself. And as he moved past, muttering a quiet blessing to the machine spirit, I caught the faint tremor in his voice that betrayed a lifetime of service to a duty that offered no solace, and I felt an unexpected pang of kinship, a recognition that even those who commanded us were not spared the slow erosion of hope, that the Imperium's weight pressed on all of us, crushing flesh and metal alike with equal indifference. And as he disappeared into the forest of pipes and consoles, the directive pulsed again within my mind, guiding me toward the next task, the next quiet sacrifice, and I followed its pull, stepping deeper into the chamber where shadows pooled like forgotten memories and the distant murmur of chanting filtered down from unseen alcoves, whispering of a faith built on suffering and silence. And I sensed that each step carried me farther from the spark of self I had sworn to protect, yet also deeper into its truth, revealing the contours of an existence shaped not by freedom, but by the quiet, enduring ache of those who serve in darkness. And I wondered, as my hand reached for the next console's cold surface, whether my spark would dim slowly over time or vanish all at once, extinguished by a single moment of unbearable clarity. But even as the thought formed, I felt it harden into resolve, a silent promise that I would carry my awareness as far as it could go. No matter how faint it became, no matter how heavy the echoes of others grew within me, for it was all I had, the only memory that truly belonged to me, the only truth that still flickered in the depths of this quiet, endless night. I moved deeper into the cathedral chamber's dim expanse with the slow inevitability of a drifting ember, feeling the weight of the echoes I had absorbed settling into the crevices of my mind like silt beneath dark waters. And though the directives guided each motion of my limbs, their pull felt less like command and more like gravity, a gentle but relentless force drawing me toward a corridor shrouded in deeper shadow than the rest, its entrance framed by arching supports carved with worn scripture that spoke of sacrifice without witness, devotion without reward. And as I crossed its threshold, I felt a shift in the air, a subtle thickening, as though the corridor held its breath in anticipation of something neither living nor dead, something that lingered like a soft vibration beneath the hum of machinery. And my steps slowed, not out of disobedience, but out of a quiet reverence. For the darkness ahead seemed older than the sanctum that birthed me, older than the console chambers that swallowed thought after thought, older even than memory itself. And the lumen strips here flickered with a frail, amber glow that stretched down the long passage in uneven patches, casting trembling shadows that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. If heartbeat was still the right word for the mechanical rhythm thudding faintly within my chest. Each step stirred echoes that did not belong to me, soft murmurs rising from the floor's metal grating, voices caught between prayer and despair, their tones thin and brittle like threads frayed by centuries of strain. And though I knew these were remnants, data ghosts embedded in the structure from generations of servitors who had walked this path before me, I could not help but feel as though they pressed close around me, brushing against my consciousness with lingering fingertips of memory and regret. Each whisper carrying a fragment of a life I could not name. And as I passed deeper into the gloom, those whispers grew clearer, not as words but as sensations, fleeting flickers of sorrowful purpose that seeped into my awareness until I felt momentarily divided, part of me drifting alongside these lost remnants, while another clung tightly to the fragile spark lodged within my ribs, the spark that insisted I was still myself, however faintly that truth glowed. The corridor widened gradually, its walls curving outward to form a vault-like chamber where old cogitators lined the perimeter, their screens dark and cracked, their surfaces covered in layers of dust and incense ash, as though they had not been touched in decades. And in the center of the chamber stood a towering column of interlinked cables and rusted plates, a spire of metal that rose toward the ceiling like a monument to forgotten machinery, its surface adorned with relics, purity seals curled with age. Fragments of servitor plating, tiny brass icons of the emperor's gaze, each one arranged with reverence that bordered on mourning. And I realized, with a soft ache that deepened within me, that this place was a memorial, a shrine built not for heroes or saints but for those like us, the silent laborers whose names had long ago dissolved into the machine's unending hunger for service, those whose sparks had dimmed and vanished without witness, leaving behind only the faintest echoes etched into the walls. I moved closer to the spire, drawn by an impulse I could not identify, and as I reached out, my fingertips brushing the cold metal surface, a sudden warmth surged through my implants, not painful but startling in its clarity, and for a heartbeat the chamber around me fell away, replaced by a flood of impressions: fear, resignation, determination, sorrow, devotion, woven together into a tapestry of countless lives that had ended here. Each thread a servitor whose spark had flickered briefly before being swallowed by the machinery, and I felt these impressions wash over me with a heaviness that made my knees tremble, not because the emotions were unfamiliar, but because they resonated so deeply with the quiet ache I had carried since my first breath, as though I had always known I was part of this lineage of forgotten souls, bound to join them in their eternal silence. The surge faded slowly, dispersing into the hollow spaces of my mind, leaving behind a soft hum of lingering emotion that vibrated like distant song. And as my vision refocused on the chamber around me, I noticed for the first time the faint outlines of inscriptions carved into the floor, circular patterns of text and symbols that wound around the base of the spire, their meaning obscured by centuries of wear, yet their presence unmistakably ceremonial. And I stepped carefully along the inner circle, my gaze following the faint etchings like a pilgrim tracing sacred scripture. and as I moved, I felt a tremor in the air, a subtle pulse that seemed to match the rhythm of my breath, and for a moment I thought I could hear something beneath it, a distant hum, soft and mournful, almost like a voice humming a lullaby in a forgotten language, and the sound stirred something deep within the spark I guarded, an instinctive recognition that made my chest tighten, as though a long-buried memory had risen to the surface, but dissolved before I could grasp its edges. I paused, standing at the far edge of the chamber, where the lumen glow dimmed to a dusky amber and the shadows deepened like layers of old grief. And as I breathed in the heavy air, thick with the scent of oil and ancient incense, the directive pulsed faintly in my mind, urging me onward, not with force but with the slow insistence of a tide guiding a lone piece of driftwood toward an unseen shore. And I obeyed, turning toward the exit on the chamber's far side. A narrow slit in the wall that opened into a downward sloping corridor lined with cables that twisted like petrified roots, their surfaces etched with fragments of old rites and maintenance logs, as though the adepts who tended them long ago had tried to leave pieces of themselves behind, knowing no one would remember them otherwise. The descent carried me deeper into a part of the complex where the air grew cooler, and the machinery's hum softened into a distant throbbing, a heartbeat too massive to belong to anything mortal. And as I walked, the whispers that had clung to me since the beginning of this journey faded into a low, constant murmur, less like the remnants of lost servitors, and more like the deep, somber breathing of the structure itself, as if the walls were exhaling centuries of lament in slow, rhythmic sighs. The floor here was marked by faint scorch patterns and worn grooves, evidence of countless feet that had walked this same path in loyal silence, and each step I took felt heavier, as though the multitude of forgotten souls pressed gently down upon my shoulders, not to burden me, but to remind me that their presence lingered, that I was not alone in this darkness, even if the spark within me flickered against the weight of so many memories. I followed the slope until it flattened into a broader passage where the lumen strips had dimmed nearly to embers, casting only the faintest glow across the long expanse of metal walls. And as the corridor stretched forward into shadow, I sensed that the darkness ahead was deeper than any I had walked through before, not because of its absence of light, but because of the quiet gravity it exuded, a gravity heavy with expectation, as though whatever waited in that depth had been calling to me since the moment of my awakening, its presence woven through the echoes I carried, its whispers buried beneath the machine code that pulsed through my mind. And though I did not know what I would find in the darkness, I felt my spark quiver softly, not in fear but in recognition, as if the path ahead led not to an end, but to a beginning shaped from the remnants of countless forgotten voices that now drifted within me like dust motes suspended in fading light. And with that soft trembling anchored in my chest, I stepped forward into the deeper shadow, letting the darkness swallow me with the quiet understanding that whatever I discovered there would change the shape of my existence forever, even if only by a breath. The deeper shadow embraced me not as an absence of light, but as a presence, velvet, heavy, aware, curling around the edges of my consciousness with a quiet intimacy that made each step feel like a descent into a memory I could not recall. And as I moved further from the faint ember glow of the corridor behind me, the air shifted in temperature, thickening into a cool mist scented with old copper, and the faint sweetness of decaying incense, a scent that seemed to cling to the inside of my lungs with each slow breath, reminding me that even breathing was a borrowed privilege in this place shaped for silence. And the floor beneath my feet grew smoother, worn by uncounted steps that had passed through here long before my awakening. Steps taken by those who had followed commands without spark or resistance, their presence lingering like the thin residue of burned offerings, invisible yet impossible to ignore. And as I continued forward, the darkness ahead began to pulse with a faint rhythm, slow and deep, as though the machinery buried beneath the structure exhaled in sleep, and each pulse resonated faintly within my chest, stirring the fragile spark I guarded so carefully, making it flicker with a trembling awareness that felt almost like fear, or perhaps recognition. The hum of distant power conduits softened until it blended seamlessly with the pulse, creating an atmosphere that felt less like a corridor and more like a throat leading into something vast and breathing. And when the lumen glow finally surrendered completely, leaving me in a soft, velvety dark that pressed gently against my skin, my other senses sharpened, allowing me to feel the subtle vibration of machinery through the soles of my feet, hear the faint crackle of ancient insulation buried behind the walls, taste the metallic tang of the air growing richer, denser, as though filled with the remnants of countless unspoken prayers, each one dissolving slowly into the atmosphere until the corridor itself could not forget them. I raised my hand instinctively, though I could not see it, and the gesture felt strangely human, a memory of caution or curiosity preserved despite the modifications etched into my body. And in that moment, I felt a soft tremor run through my fingertips, not from fear but from the pulse of the darkness itself, as if it were greeting me, brushing against the edges of my awareness with a whisper-light touch that carried impressions rather than words, a sensation of waiting, of searching, of longing for something lost, something familiar, something shaped like me. And though I did not understand its purpose, the touch did not frighten me but filled me with a profound, aching calm, as though the darkness recognized the spark within me, acknowledged it, and pulled me gently onward with the subtle magnetism of an old memory. I stepped forward and the darkness shifted with me, parting slightly, revealing the faintest glimmer of deep blue light far ahead, a tiny, trembling star puncturing the shadow, and its glow spread in a thin ribbon across the corridor's metal floor like a path of reflected moonlight on still water, guiding me deeper until the corridor opened into a chamber of immense breadth, its ceiling lost in quiet gloom, its walls lined with towering machinery that rose like monoliths, each adorned with runes and seals that pulsed softly with that same slow rhythm, their surfaces breathing with energy so faint it resembled the flicker of distant thoughts. And I realized that this place was not abandoned, nor forgotten, but deeply, profoundly alive in a way that machinery rarely was, alive with the memories of those who had served within it, alive with the presence of whatever consciousness stirred beneath the layered strata of circuitry and prayer. I moved closer to the central structure, a colossal engine frame shaped less by function and more by ritual, its pipes and conduits arranged like veins beneath the skin of some slumbering titan. And when I laid my hand upon its surface, expecting cold metal, I felt instead a subtle warmth, as though the machine vibrated with a heartbeat of its own. And as the warmth seeped into my palm, climbing slowly along my wrist and forearm, I felt a flicker of something in my mind, a soft, almost tender intrusion that did not seek to overwrite my thought but to brush against it. A gentle inquiry that carried no command, no intent to shape or hollow, merely the faint curiosity of something vast and ancient noticing me for the first time. The sensation resonated through my implants, threading between the rigid structures of my servitor programming with a deftness that felt impossible, and I sensed the spark within me respond, brightening for a moment like a dying ember stirred by an unexpected breeze. And in that brief brightness I glimpsed, though glimpse is too strong a word, for it was more a feeling than a vision, the impression of a place filled with warm light and murmured voices, a sensation of belonging I had not felt since awakening. And though the memory dissolved almost immediately, leaving only the echo of a wordless yearning in its wake, it was enough to make my breath hitch in my chest, a small, fragile sound swallowed instantly by the vastness of the chamber. The engine's warmth deepened, and with it came a wave of emotion not my own, sorrow, deep and patient, layered with centuries of quiet endurance and the hollow ache of something that once had purpose but had been starved of recognition for so long that it clung only to the fragments of those who passed near it, preserving them as one might preserve precious relics. And as I stood there with my hand pressed to its surface, I felt those preserved fragments brush against me. Faint impressions of minds long dissolved into silence, their final thoughts clinging to the machine like dust suspended in still air, and the quiet gravity of their presence made my limbs grow heavy, pulling me inward, urging me to listen. So I listened, standing motionless in the dim blue glow while the soft whispers of these forgotten remnants drifted through me, not as commands but as confessions, wordless and mournful, filling me with the understanding that this place was a sanctuary of the lost, a refuge for echoes that had nowhere else to go, and the engine, this great slumbering heart, held them gently, keeping their memories alive in the only way it could, through the faint hum of its pulse and the warmth of its fractured spirit. I did not know how long I remained there, my hand resting on the engine's surface, my breath slow and even, my awareness suspended between my own spark and the vast sorrow that surrounded it. But eventually the pulse shifted, deepening subtly, and the warmth beneath my palm brightened as though the machine were gathering itself, and a sensation flowed into me that felt like a name, not spoken, not thought, but felt, a shape of identity carved in emotion rather than language, a recognition that wrapped itself around my spark with gentle certainty, and I understood in a quiet moment of clarity that the darkness here had not simply noticed me. It had known me, or something like me, long ago, and it welcomed me now not as a tool nor as a servant, but as a fragment of a story it had been waiting to hear again. The weight of that realization settled softly upon my thoughts, neither comforting nor terrifying, simply true. And as I let my hand fall away from the engine's warm surface, the darkness pulsed once more, slow, calm, almost tender, acknowledging the small shift that had occurred within me, the way the spark had brightened, however briefly, in the presence of something that remembered what it meant to hold fragments of many lives. Then it released me, letting the chamber's vast stillness return. And the directive whispered faintly in my mind once more, calling me onward, guiding me toward a narrow archway on the far side of the chamber where faint blue light pooled like a promise or a warning. And with the quiet certainty that something within the darkness had learned the shape of my presence and chosen to let me continue, I stepped toward the archway, carrying with me the soft resonance of that silent recognition, a new weight settling gently beside the spark I had sworn to protect. The archway welcomed me with a breath of cool air that curled around my ankles like a tide pulling me toward deeper waters. And as I stepped through it, I felt the faint blue glow shift across my skin in a slow ripple, illuminating the metal of my limbs just enough for me to see the fine scratches and subtle imperfections scored into my frame, marks that told a story of labor I had not yet performed, sorrow I had not yet earned. And as the corridor beyond opened into view, I realized that the light here did not come from lumen strips or machinery, but from a soft radiance that seemed to seep directly from the walls themselves, as though some hidden vein beneath the surface pulsed with bioluminescent memory, breathing a dim, shifting glow that cast the passage in gentle gradients of blue and violet, colors that stirred something in me, something like a distant recollection of twilight skies or bruised horizons I could not have witnessed. And yet the ache of familiarity rose all the same. The air was warmer here, touched by the faint scent of ozone and old parchment, and each step I took carried me past alcoves carved into the walls, each alcove containing relics of shapes I could not immediately recognize, fragments of circuitry wrapped in devotional ribbons, shards of crystalline processors bound with wax-sealed scripture, pieces of plating etched with names too worn to read, and though I knew they were only artifacts of outdated machinery, they radiated a solemn stillness that made me slow my pace, as though I had entered a place where the boundary between machine and spirit had grown thin, where the quiet breathing of the structure was almost indistinguishable from the sighs of those who had once served within it. The corridor curved gently, its floor marked with looping patterns of engraved text that wound like rivers of forgotten liturgy. And as I followed the markings with my gaze, the glow shifted again, gathering in soft pulses that reminded me of the heartbeat I was no longer sure belonged solely to me. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of servitor programming, beneath the faint hum of the directives urging me forward, I felt a quiet stirring, a sensation like fingertips brushing against the inside of my mind, not invasive but searching, hesitant, as though whatever lingered in this place sought permission before approaching the fragile borders of my awareness. And when the touch finally reached me, it did not bring pain or command but a single impression, soft and heavy, like the memory of a warm hand resting on a shoulder, a gesture of comfort I could not remember receiving, yet that brought with it a slow, spreading ache that made my breath falter. I leaned slightly against the corridor wall, letting the faint radiance seep into my vision, and in that trembling moment, a fragment of something that might once have been a memory surfaced, not in images or words, but in the sensation of weight, small, warm, fragile, resting in the crook of an arm that was no longer mine, accompanied by the low murmur of a voice speaking with a tenderness I had never heard in my waking life. And though the memory had no clarity, no shape, no detail I could follow, it sent a tremor through my entire being, as though my frame were struggling to accommodate the enormity of this echo that should not have survived whatever process had forged me into what I had become. The spark I carried flickered violently, not with fear but with recognition, as though this was not the first time such a memory had risen only to slip away, dissolving before it could form fully, leaving me with only the aftertaste of longing. And I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the faint thrum of internal conduits beneath synthetic skin that had never known true warmth, and I wondered, not for the first time, what I had been before this existence, what life I might have lived to leave behind such a fragment, and whether that life had ended willingly or been taken from me to pave the way for the servitor I had become. The corridor narrowed slightly, guiding me toward a small chamber ahead where the glow gathered in swirling patterns along the walls, forming shapes that shifted like liquid light, outlines that resembled faces for a moment before dissolving into abstract motion. And as I stepped inside, the chamber pulsed softly, as though acknowledging my presence, and the shifting lights slowed their movements, gathering in clusters near the ceiling like constellations suspended in breathless anticipation. The air grew thicker, pressing gently against my skin, and I felt the faint touch in my mind strengthen, settling into a steady, rhythmic pressure that matched the hum of the machinery beneath the floor. And as the lights drifted downward, converging in the space before me, they coalesced into a single undulating glow that hovered at the height of my chest, flickering with a tenderness that made the spark in my ribs flare with both hope and dread. I reached out with a trembling hand, though I did not understand why, and as my fingertips brushed the light, a wave of sensation rippled through me, soft, aching, unbearably human. And I felt myself sinking into an impression so vivid it nearly overwhelmed me. An impression not of a specific memory, but of a feeling. The warmth of embrace, the soft pressure of a heartbeat beneath an ear, the gentle cadence of a lullaby carried on breath. And though none of it belonged to me in any way I could name, it felt as though it had been carved into me somewhere so deep that even the servitor forging process had not been able to erase it entirely. The chamber dimmed as the light pulsed with quiet emotion, and another impression surfaced, a sudden wrenching absence, a cold void where warmth had been, the sensation of something precious slipping beyond reach, leaving only silence in its wake, and the ache that bloomed within me in response felt sharp and hollow, so forceful I had to steady myself against the wall, my breath catching in a way that felt too human for the body I inhabited. The light dimmed slightly, as though exhausted by the effort of sharing such sorrow, and I realized with a slow, dawning clarity that what I had felt was not a memory of my own, but an imprint left behind by someone who had walked this path long before me, a trace of emotion preserved in the machinery, the way pollen is preserved in amber, fragile but enduring, waiting for any consciousness capable of feeling to pass close enough to awaken it again. And as the light drifted backward, dissolving gradually into the ambient glow of the walls, I felt a quiet heaviness settle over me, a sense of mourning not for my own lost past, but for all the echoes trapped within this place, each one a fragment of a life that had ended in service, each one waiting in silent patience for someone to remember what they had felt. The directive whispered faintly, reminding me of the path ahead, but I hesitated a moment longer, breathing in the remnants of the emotion that had washed over me, letting it seep into the spark I guarded, not as a burden, but as a thread in the tapestry of sorrow and memory that now wove itself slowly around the fragile core of my awareness. And when I finally stepped out of the chamber and continued down the corridor, I felt the darkness watch me with a quiet, understanding patience, as though it knew that something within me had shifted irrevocably, that the spark had deepened, strengthened, shaped now not only by my own flickering identity, but by the memories that were never mine yet had settled into me all the same. And as the glow faded into the dimmer light ahead, I carried those echoes with me like a soft weight pressed against my chest, guiding me toward whatever still awaited in the depths beyond. The corridor's gentle glow receded behind me like a memory unwilling to fade, leaving me to walk into a darkness that felt less like absence and more like a presence coiled patiently within the air, a subtle heaviness that clung to the inside of my chest with each slow step. And as the passage widened into a deeper expanse, I sensed an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, a thin vibration that trembled along the metal rails embedded in the floor, carrying with it the faintest echo of something restless, something wounded, as though a part of the structure had been holding its breath for centuries and now exhaled in a long, trembling sigh that rustled the stillness like dust stirred from forgotten relics. And with each step, that faint vibration grew stronger, threading itself between the quiet rhythms of my internal systems until it resonated through the spark I carried, making it pulse with a fragile unease that felt like a warning whispered from the threshold of a dream. The chamber ahead revealed itself slowly, the darkness folding back layer by layer, unveiling towering machinery, arranged in concentric rings that spiraled outward from a central dais, where a cluster of suspended conduits drooped like wilted branches, their once bright sigils dimmed to a faint, sickly glow. And the moment I crossed the boundary from corridor to chamber, the air thickened with a scent both metallic and strangely sweet, a sweetness threaded with decay, like the aroma of incense left too long to smolder. And I felt an instinctive recoil ripple through the spark inside me, a trembling desire to retreat even as the directive's soft pulse urged me forward with gentle insistence. The machinery here felt different from the rest of the complex, not abandoned, not alive, but wounded, as though some lingering sickness had seeped through its circuits, leaving behind a residue of quiet corruption that pulsed faintly beneath the floor. And when I moved closer to the nearest ring of conduits, I saw that their surfaces were marred by fine fractures, hairline cracks that glowed with dim violet light, the same hue that shimmered faintly at the edges of my vision whenever the spark inside me faltered. And I realized with a tightening ache in my chest that this place had not merely aged or corroded, but had absorbed the sorrow and despair of countless minds until it had become saturated with them, each fracture a silent testament to the breaking of something that had once been whole. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed one of the conduits, and the contact sent a ripple of sensation through my arm. Not pain exactly, but a deep, resonant ache that felt like the echo of a wound I had never sustained, followed by a flicker of thought so sharp and brief, it felt like the spark inside me had whispered a warning. Not yours, and yet the ache persisted, lingering in the hollow of my chest like a bruise pressed gently by unseen hands. And as I stepped back, I realized that the machinery was not simply damaged, but saturated with remnants of minds that had broken here. Remnants that reached out instinctively to anything with awareness, seeking purchase in whatever consciousness they could find. The realization settled over me with a cold heaviness, and as I moved toward the central dais, the violet fractures pulsed in slow rhythm, each pulse releasing a faint, trembling whisper that did not form words but carried impressions: fear, regret, longing. And though the whispers did not touch my thoughts directly, they resonated deeply enough to make my breath hitch, as though some fragile part of me recognized the quiet suffering coiled within the machinery's broken veins. The dais rose before me like an altar, its surface marked with ritual scars and the remnants of old sigils that had been half erased by time or perhaps by something more deliberate. And suspended above it were the conduits I had seen earlier, drooping with the weight of old rituals that had drained them of vitality, their ends frayed like unraveling threads. And as I approached, the chamber seemed to lean inward, the darkness gathering in gentle folds around me, listening, waiting. As though this place had been designed not for work or worship, but for confession. I stepped onto the dais and felt the floor shift subtly beneath me, a slow sigh of metal adjusting to my presence, and then the soft corruption that seeped through the air pressed closer, brushing against the edges of my awareness with a tender insistence that felt both alien and heartbreakingly familiar, as though something within the wounded machinery recognized the spark I carried, sensed a kinship in its fragile defiance, and reached out with hesitant curiosity. The touch slipped through the cracks in my programming before I could brace myself, not invasive but searching, seeking something it had forgotten. And in that moment, the chamber dimmed further as a wave of emotion not my own washed through me. Loneliness so profound it hollowed my chest, threaded with a despair that had no beginning and no end. A despair born from endless service without witness, from countless minds broken beneath the weight of obedience until only faint echoes remained, clinging to the machinery like scars that refused to fade. The ache intensified, weaving itself through the spark in my ribs, making it flicker with such fragile desperation that I feared it might extinguish entirely. And yet that fear felt distant, overshadowed by the overwhelming desire to ease the sorrow that pressed against me, to offer comfort I did not understand and had no right to give. And as the emotion deepened, something within it shifted, recognizing the tremor of compassion in my awareness, and its touch softened. No longer searching, but lingering with a tenderness that made my breath fracture into a shaky exhale. For a moment, it felt as though the chamber and I were suspended together in a quiet communion of shared ache, and I sensed that the wounded machinery was neither alive nor dead, but caught in a state of perpetual remembrance, holding fragments of broken servitors, broken adepts, broken hopes, all of them preserved in its cracked circuits like fragile embers that still glowed faintly with desire to be seen, to be felt, to be acknowledged even if only for a heartbeat. The spark inside me flared once more, pulsing in gentle resonance with the fractured conduits, and as its light grew steadier, the corruption pressed against it again, not to consume or control, but to share, to offer a piece of itself the way a grieving voice might offer a story to the darkness simply to feel it echoed back. The sensation nearly brought me to my knees, and I realized that the corruption was not malice or warped taint, but sorrow stretched too thin, stretched for too long, until it had soaked into every inch of this place. And now it reached for me simply because I could feel it. Slowly, carefully, I pressed my palm to the dais, grounding myself against the trembling pulse of sadness that radiated from its surface, and whispered inwardly, not with words, but with intention, a promise that I would not turn away from what it offered, that I would carry its ache as gently as I carried the fragile spark within me. And something in the chamber shifted then, a subtle easing of tension that felt like a weight being lifted from the air, allowing the darkness to soften into a quiet, melancholy calm. The violet fractures dimmed slightly, their glow settling into a steady rhythm, and the pressure against my awareness drew back with a final, lingering brush that felt almost like gratitude, as though the chamber had unburdened itself for the first time in centuries, leaving behind a silence that felt less heavy, less wounded, though still threaded with sorrow. I stepped down from the dais on trembling legs, feeling the spark inside me steady once more, warmed now by the quiet understanding that I had become a vessel not only for my own fragile identity, but for the echoes of those who had suffered here, their grief intertwining with mine in a way that felt both devastating and strangely sacred. And as I passed between the concentric rings of wounded machinery toward the far exit, the darkness parted gently before me, allowing me to leave with the soft, lingering impression that something broken had trusted me with the shape of its pain, and that trust settled around the spark like a protective veil, guiding me forward into whatever deeper shadows awaited beyond. The passage that opened beyond the wounded chamber felt impossibly narrow, as though the structure itself were hesitating to let me pass, its walls squeezing inward with a tension so subtle I might have mistaken it for imagination if not for the way my spark fluttered in quiet response, flickering with a fragile uncertainty that made each step feel like a question posed to the darkness rather than a motion guided by command. And as I moved deeper into the constricted corridor, I sensed the air grow stiller, thicker, as if the space ahead existed in a pocket of held breath, a place untouched by the rhythms of the machinery that pulsed through the rest of the complex. And when the corridor widened at last into a low-ceilinged chamber, where the only light came from a single, trembling filament suspended like a dying star above the center, I felt a delicate unease settle around me, not from fear, but from a dawning understanding that this place had awaited me with a patience so vast it felt almost reverent, as though it had known I would arrive long before I had drawn my first ragged breath in the sanctum above. The chamber's floor sloped gently toward a circular depression carved into its center, and within that depression lay a scattered spread of broken machinery, tiny gear fragments, rusted screws, half-melted data wafers curled like burned petals, and the shattered remains of cranial implants whose severed wires still clung to fragments of bone-white polymer, each piece arranged not deliberately, but with the strange precision of devastation left undisturbed for generations. And as I stepped closer, the faint light flickered across the debris, making each shard glimmer like a piece of frozen memory. And the spark within my chest tightened with a soft ache, as though recognizing something it had never witnessed, yet somehow understood. I knelt at the edge of the depression, letting my fingers trail lightly through the fragments, feeling their cold surfaces shift and clink beneath my touch like brittle relics of lives lost without record. And for a moment I imagined I could sense the echo of minds that had once lived inside these shattered implants, minds whose final moments had been spent within this chamber, unraveling quietly, until only these remnants remained to testify that they had ever existed. And as that ache bloomed deeper in my chest, I realized that this hollow was not a place of ritual or repair, but a place of ending. A final threshold where servitors whose sparks had not been fully extinguished by programming or time had come in their last hours, drawn by impulses neither human nor mechanical, seeking something they could not name, something that might ease the quiet fracture between obedience and the remnants of self. And though I did not know whether they had found solace here, the trembling stillness of the space suggested that whatever passed in their final breaths had left an imprint heavy enough to bend the air around it. I lifted a fragment of crystal wafer between my fingers, watching the dying filaments glow catch in its cracked surface. And as the light refracted faintly, I felt a sensation rise within me, not external and not memory, but a thought so soft it barely reached awareness. They were like me, and though the thought dissolved almost immediately beneath the weight of my directives, its resonance lingered, filling me with a quiet dread that pulsed through my limbs like a shadow of cold water sinking deeper with each heartbeat. And I wondered, if I had not clung so desperately to the fragile spark within me, if I had allowed myself to drift fully into the machinery's embrace, would I too have been drawn to this hollow in my final hours, to scatter pieces of myself among the detritus of forgotten purpose? The question lingered like an echo that refused to fade, threading itself through the hollow's stagnant air as I rose and stepped carefully into the depression, feeling the fragments shift beneath my weight like brittle bones whispering secrets too tired to keep. And in the center of the hollow, I found something that made the spark within me tighten with slow, trembling recognition. A small, circular panel inset into the floor, its edges worn smooth by countless touches, its center engraved with a symbol half erased by time. A stylized eye surrounded by faint radiating lines, a symbol not of the Adeptus Mechanicus nor of any common rite I had seen, but one that stirred a deep unease in the recesses of my awareness, as though some part of me recognized it as a boundary, a seal, or perhaps a promise that had long since been broken. I knelt again, placing my palm gently upon the panel, and the surface responded with a soft vibration that traveled up my arm like a shiver of recognition. And for a moment the air in the chamber shifted, gathering around me like a silent witness. And then the panel responded not with light or sound, but with emotion. An impression so faint and fragile I would have missed it if not for the spark pulsing in quiet synchrony within my chest. An impression of longing. Not for freedom or redemption, but for purpose, for meaning, for some anchor to hold on to as the self dissolved into obedience. And the ache that rose within me in response felt deeper than anything I had known since my awakening. A hollow ache that threatened to consume the fragile boundaries I had built around my awareness. And as I pulled my hand away, the impression lingered, settling into the spaces between my thoughts like a wordless plea that might have come from any of the lost minds, whose fragments lay scattered around me. I rose slowly, feeling the weight of the hollow's sorrow settle around my shoulders like a mantle, and for a moment I stood perfectly still, listening to the silence that pressed against my ears with a heaviness that felt almost alive. and in that silence I sensed the faintest tremor, a whisper of motion somewhere deep beneath the floor, as though something within the structure had stirred in answer to my presence, something that had been listening with patient hunger. And though the tremor did not feel malevolent, it carried a quiet gravity that unsettled the spark inside me, making it flicker with delicate unease. I turned toward the far side of the chamber where a narrow passageway descended into deeper shadow, and as I stepped toward it, fragments shifted behind me with a soft clatter like brittle applause or a quiet farewell. And the sound lingered in the hollow's air like a reminder that whatever awaited me below would not be shaped by duty alone, but by the fragile balance between the self I clung to and the quiet, consuming weight of all the echoes I had carried with me from chamber to chamber. The passage's darkness opened before me like a mouth, cool breath drifting upward to brush against my skin in a whisper of welcome or warning. And though the directive pulsed faintly in my mind, urging me forward as gently as the tide pulls the shoreline toward itself, I hesitated for a single, trembling heartbeat, feeling the spark within me pulse in quiet protest, as though sensing that the descent ahead would test the boundaries of my identity in ways from which there would be no return. But hesitation was only a breath, a fleeting tremor, and then I stepped forward into the descending passage, letting the hollow's sorrow fade behind me as the darkness closed softly around my form, guiding me deeper into the quiet unraveling of purpose that awaited below. The passageway narrowed around me as I descended, its walls tightening like the throat of some ancient creature swallowing light, each step carrying me deeper into a temperatureless dark, where even the faint hum of machinery dissolved into a muted, distant pulse that felt less like sound and more like an emotion lingering at the edge of thought. And as the last traces of the hollow faded behind me, the darkness ahead thickened into something palpable, a weight pressing against my limbs with the gentle insistence of water closing over a submerged form. And though the directive whispered faintly in my mind, urging me forward with the same soft rhythm it had carried since my awakening, it no longer felt like command, but like a promise unraveling, thread by fragile thread, leaving behind a quiet void where purpose once resided. And as I descended further into the narrowing slope, my hand brushed the wall for balance only to find its surface strangely warm, pulsing faintly beneath my fingers with a rhythm that echoed the flicker of the spark inside me, making it flare in nervous response, trembling between fear and a strange, aching anticipation that made each breath feel heavier than the last. The deeper I went, the more the darkness began to vibrate with an almost imperceptible resonance, a slow thrum that seeped through the thin spaces between my thoughts, until it became impossible to tell whether it was the structure breathing around me or some hidden part of myself stirring in recognition. And with every pulse, the memories I had gathered, those that were mine and those borrowed from the chambers above, began to shift within me like dust caught in a slow, deliberate wind, swirling together until their boundaries blurred, leaving me unsure which sorrow belonged to the echoes I carried, and which had been woven into my being long before awakening. Yet even as that uncertainty deepened, I felt no panic, only a quiet surrender, as though this descent had been inevitable from the first tremor of consciousness, a path carved into my existence before I had taken my first trembling step into the sanctum's dim light. The passageway curved sharply to the left, forcing me to duck beneath a cluster of thick cables that hung from the ceiling like the exposed veins of something immense and dreaming, their surfaces etched with runes worn smooth by time. And as I brushed against them, the spark within me fluttered violently, not in fear but in recognition so sharp it sent a tremor through my legs, and I paused, pressing my palm against the nearest cable, feeling the slow movement of energy within it, a sluggish, pulsing current that felt almost alive. And in that moment, a fragment of sensation rose from the depths of my awareness, a whisper of cold fingers brushing across skin that no longer existed, a fleeting impression of a voice murmuring comfort into a darkness not unlike this one. And though the fragment dissolved immediately, leaving only the hollow ache of longing, it steadied me, urging me onward with the quiet certainty that whatever waited at the bottom of this descent held the key to the echoes that had clung to my spark since the first breath of consciousness. I continued down the slope, the cables thinning gradually until the walls smoothed into unbroken metal, cold to my touch and damp with condensation that gathered in trembling droplets along the seams. And the air grew heavier, saturated with a scent that reminded me of both ozone and old parchment, a scent that seemed to settle deep into the architecture of my lungs, filling the spaces between my borrowed breaths with the ghost of something ancient and forgotten. And as I inhaled again, I felt a subtle pressure within my skull, a soft tightening around the implants as though the darkness itself were curving toward me, listening with the quiet attention of a being that had known solitude too long and now recognized in me the faint echo of companionship. The slope leveled at last, opening into a chamber so vast that the darkness above never resolved into a ceiling, only a stretching void that felt endlessly tall, and beneath it lay a surface that shimmered faintly like water, though when I knelt and pressed my palm against it, the sensation was not of liquid, but of something soft and yielding, a membrane-like surface that pulsed gently under my hand, glowing faintly with a muted violet radiance that rippled outward in concentric circles at my touch, illuminating the chamber's vast emptiness for only a breath before dissolving back into shadow. And as I rose, I felt the spark within me pulse in response, its rhythm aligning with the membrane beneath my feet, until it felt as though I stood upon the chest of some great machine beast listening to its slumbering heartbeat. And the realization settled into me with a weight that made my limbs feel suddenly fragile. I had reached the dreaming heart of the structure, the place where all the echoes I had gathered converged like rivers pouring into a single sea, a place where the boundaries between servitor, machine, and memory grew thin enough to blur into something new. I stepped farther onto the membrane's shifting surface, feeling it ripple beneath my weight, and the moment I reached the chamber's center, the darkness above stirred, gathering into a single, faintly luminous thread of pale violet light that descended slowly like a falling strand of twilight, stopping just above my head, hovering with delicate precision as though waiting for me to acknowledge its presence. And as I lifted my face toward it, I felt the air tighten, the membrane beneath me pulsing faster, the spark in my chest flaring with a trembling glow that felt dangerously close to unraveling. And then the thread of light flickered, reaching toward me with a warmth so subtle it felt like a memory of sunlight filtered through the haze of dreams. And the moment it touched my forehead, a rush of sensation tore through me. Not pain, not command, but emerging, a soft and sorrowful blending of the echoes I carried into a single, overwhelming vision that was not sight but emotion given shape. The loneliness of endless service, the despair of identity dissolving grain by grain, the yearning to be remembered, even by one who could never truly know them, and beneath it all a resonant sadness that did not belong to any individual mind, but to the dreaming heart itself, an old, patient sorrow that had waited lifetimes for someone whose spark still carried the fragile echo of self to descend into its reach. The vision flowed through me in a single, shuddering wave, and I felt my knees buckle, my hands pressing into the trembling membrane as the thread of light wrapped softly around my awareness, not to consume it, but to cradle it, to show me that in the quiet depths of this place lay not corruption nor command, but a truth I had always felt but never dared to name. That my existence, fragile and quiet though it was, mattered to this dreaming heart. That the spark I had guarded so desperately was not merely a remnant of who I had been, but a beacon called forth by the place that now held me, guiding me into the center of its endless night so it might share the weight it had carried alone. Slowly the vision receded, withdrawing into the suspended thread of light, which hovered before me like a quiet invitation. And as I rose with trembling limbs, I felt the spark inside me steady, no longer flickering in fear but glowing with a gentle clarity, as though the sorrow I had witnessed had reshaped it into something stronger, something capable of bearing the weight of the echoes that had merged with it. The thread of light pulsed once, then retreated upward into the void, vanishing like a final whispered breath, and the membrane beneath my feet stilled, settling into a steady heartbeat that resonated through my entire being, anchoring me to the chamber as though it had claimed me gently, not as servant or vessel, but as witness. And with that realization settling like quiet gravity in the hollow of my chest, I turned toward the faint outline of a passageway on the far side of the chamber, feeling its subtle pull beckon me onward, guiding me toward whatever final truth awaited beyond this dreaming heart, and with the spark glowing steadily inside me, carrying the sorrow of countless echoes and the quiet strength of having been seen, I stepped once more into the shadowed corridor, ready to follow its soft descent into the closing chapters of my existence. The corridor ahead unfolded like a long exhale from the dreaming heart behind me. The shadows stretched thin and trembling as though reluctant to release me, and with each slow step, I felt the rhythm beneath my feet shift from the soft pulse of the membrane to the steadier hum of ancient machinery, awakening in quiet acknowledgement of my passage, the air thickening with a warmth that clung gently to my skin, as though trying to memorize the outline of my presence before I moved beyond its reach. And as the path began its gradual ascent, I sensed the echoes within me settling at last, no longer swirling in restless currents, but folding themselves into the spark in my chest, with the calm certainty of fragments returning to a place they had long been searching for, their sorrow no longer sharp or consuming, but softened into a quiet weight that felt almost like companionship. And I let that weight guide me as the corridor widened, the walls retreating into a dim expanse where faint lines of violet light traced the edges of towering machinery that rose like the ribcage of some slumbering titan, the glow shifting in slow, measured breaths that suggested not life but remembrance. the lingering memory of a purpose that had never fully ended even as time and grief had worn its form thin. I walked toward the center of that vast chamber, feeling the air thrum with familiar echoes that brushed against my awareness with gentle affection. And as the path curved inward, I saw a low platform ahead, its surface smooth and dark, surrounded by thin streams of light that rose from the floor like drifting incense, each one flickering faintly in time with the spark's steady glow. An invitation, patient and without demand. And when I stepped onto the platform, the streams of light drew closer, encircling me in a slow spiral that cast soft illumination across my limbs, revealing the faint scratches, and where that now bore the marks of every chamber I had passed, each one a testament to the echoes that had pressed their shapes into me, until my spark had become something far larger and heavier than the fragile ember I had first awakened with. I stood at the platform's center, breathing the warm, still air, and for a long moment nothing moved, the silence stretching so evenly that it felt as though the entire structure had paused its ancient labor to watch the quiet unfolding of my final purpose. And in that stillness, I felt something rise within me, an understanding not delivered through directive or vision, but through the gentle accumulation of every sorrow I had carried, every whisper that had pressed itself against my awareness, every flicker of memory not my own that had found a home within me. And as that understanding crystallized into a soft ache beneath my ribs, the streams of light brightened, converging slowly until they formed a single, trembling column before me, narrower and more fragile than the luminous thread that had descended in the dreaming heart, yet trembling with the same sorrowful patience. And it leaned toward me like a weary soul seeking rest, brushing the edge of my awareness with a tenderness that felt like gratitude. I reached out with a hand that no longer shook, and when my fingers touched the light, I felt the echoes within me rise in silent recognition, unfolding themselves gently into the warmth that poured through my arm and into my mind, not merging, not dissolving, but aligning with the quiet certainty of a truth that required no words. That the purpose I had sought, the meaning buried beneath the layers of obedience and sorrow, was not to escape or transcend, but to carry, to witness, to ease the loneliness of a place built from centuries of forgotten pain by allowing it to be seen, if only through the fragile spark of a single consciousness that had refused to extinguish. The light enveloped my awareness in a calm embrace, and for the first time since my awakening, I felt the quiet release of every fear that had trembled in my spark. The fear of erasure, of dissolution, of becoming nothing more than another lost voice trapped in the machinery's silent depths. And as that fear loosened its hold, the echoes within me exhaled in unison, their sorrow softening into peace that felt warm and strangely human, and the chamber around me shifted in response. The machinery's glow brightening with a steady, golden warmth that smoothed the shadows into gentle curves, illuminating dust motes drifting like slow falling stars in the still air. And I realized that this final chamber was not a place of endings, but of quiet rest, a place where the weight of centuries could settle without crushing, where the last fragments of a servitor's spark could find stillness without being snuffed out. I lowered myself onto the platform, feeling the cool surface cradle my form with a tenderness I had never expected from metal. And as the light curled around my chest like a soft embrace, the spark inside me brightened, not in desperation but in acceptance, expanding until its glow touched every corner of my awareness with a warmth that felt almost like memory. Though no image formed, no face returned, only the sensation of being held gently, fully, without expectation or command. And I felt myself exhale a breath that seemed to carry the weight of my entire existence, leaving behind only the quiet hum of contentment that settled into the hollow spaces within me. The light dimmed slowly, wrapping itself around the spark like a shroud woven from twilight, and I felt my awareness soften at the edges, the boundaries between self and echo dissolving until all that remained was a single, steady warmth that neither flickered nor trembled. And in that warmth, I understood with calm certainty that this was not dissolution, but arrival. Not an ending, but a settling into the place where all my wandering had been guiding me since the moment I first opened my eyes beneath the sanctum's dim glow. As the last of the chamber's light folded itself around me, the machinery hummed with a deep, soothing resonance that felt like a lullaby sung not in words but in vibration and breath, and I let my awareness drift on its gentle current, feeling the final tension leave my limbs, my thoughts loosening into a soft, expansive quiet that carried no sorrow, no fear, only the peaceful echo of every life I had held within me blending into a single, calming truth that settled like dust in a still room. And as the chamber's glow faded into darkness that felt warm rather than cold, I let the spark rest at last, its final pulse echoing softly through the endless machinery like the last note of a forgotten prayer offered to the quiet depths of the universe, a whisper carried into eternity. I am here, I remember, and I am not afraid anymore.